and actually also recommending for Magnitsky sanctions. The United States also imposed targeted sanctions against members of the regime whose names were not disclosed, and also announced that it would take further action if it were warranted. As you recall, the violence continued even with the December 16 very critical by-election in Kayunga, which was again rigged by the regime. When at the close of the voting, it was clear that the challenging candidate belonging to the National Unity Party was actually the overwhelming winner of those elections, Harriet Nakwede, but the results were awarded to Andrew Muwonge, who was a candidate of the ruling party dictatorship in Uganda. The violence continued on December 28 when the pan-international writer of courage, Kakwenza Rukirabashaya, was violently arrested, and according to his lawyer, Aaron Kiza, he has been tortured while in captivity. He is the author, of course, of Greedy Barbarian, which is a novel set in a fictional African country discussing an African dictator and how that dictator is destroying his country. Much of this information in terms of the election rigging, as many of you may recall, was well documented because it was the introduction of an app called uVote, which made a very significant difference in both the recent by-election as well as the Ugandan general elections of 2021. uVote is an app which was developed by Ugandans in diaspora. And this app allows the voters to actually capture the tellings from each of the voting precincts, as well as take a picture of what is called the declaration of results forms and beam those images to the outside. Even though the dictatorship blocked access to the Play Store, at least 100,000 Ugandans were able to download it. And using this app, they uploaded the election results, they uploaded the images, and in addition to that, they also uploaded a lot of videos showing ballot stuffing, including by soldiers in uniform. And they also recounted incidents where people described the acts of violence and intimidation that they faced. And the information uploaded on uVote was then compared with the so-called official results released by the regime to show the discrepancy and to show how this election was effectively rigged. And this has now been compiled into a 222-page book, and it's available to be downloaded. And the book is called Rigged. A link will be shared on the screen by my co-host so that people can download this information. Now, I also want us to at least get a chance to play the message from the EU representative, since a member of parliament will not be able to join us, Madame Pirette Herzberger Fofana. She's unable to join us. As many of you know, there's a recent passing of the EU Parliament President, David Sassoli. So could we play that message, and then I will introduce our speakers, and then we will get it moving, and we'll try to keep a very tight time limit so that we can get out as announced on time. Thank you. Could we play that message, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jan-Christoph Oetjen. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Renew Europe group. First of all, I want to like to express my condolences to the families who lost their loved ones during the Kampala blast on the 16th of November 2021 and due to the injustices throughout the year. Uganda is clearly in a situation of turmoil, but I want to bring a message of peace. I hope for reconciliation in Uganda. On the one-year anniversary of the elections in Uganda, I continue to be concerned with the situation of freedom of speech, political assembly, and the safety of Ugandan citizens. Instead of denying freedom of assembly, speech, and political affiliation, Uganda's government must ensure an atmosphere for political dialogue which is free, fair, and transparent elections can be guaranteed. I call on President Museveni and the Ugandan authorities to take immediate steps to end abductions by suspected state agents, to seize the unlawful detention without trial of opposition supporters, and to release all political prisoners, to cease enforced disappearances and to the practice of torture, to end their clamp down on protest rallies and political assemblies, and to end impunity of all perpetrators of human rights abuses. The European Union stands for democracy and the values of human rights and freedom of speech. We will continue to do what we can do to support people and to ensure that this is reached out across the world.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. All right, so I now introduce the speakers, and after each speaker has spoken, and David, of course, my co-host, will help us keep a very strict time. Everybody must adhere to the time. And then I will probably open up the questioning, and David will take over and then help us distribute the questions to members of the media. The first speaker joining us today is going to be David Lewis, and he is the Secretary General of the National Unity Party. David will then be followed by Dr. Lina Zedriga, and she is the Vice President of the National Unity Party. And then the party president himself, Robert Kyagulanyi, AKA Bobby Wine, will address us. And then at that point, we will take some questions from the media. So without much ado, David Lewis, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Comrade.
Good morning.
Milton, I hope everyone is delighted to be here this afternoon in Uganda and where at the time where everyone else is following us from. Of course, today comes with very, very bad memories. On this day last year, Ugandans went to the polls, and the people of Uganda decided. They came up to vote, but what they experienced was not an election. But I want to remind everyone watching us that an election is not an event, it's a process. And the process in the Ugandan context began maybe about four years ago or 3.5 years ago when we launched the Pure Power movement. And from that time, the persecution started, and we started seeing double standards. And you saw, of course, we remember what happened in Arua in 2018 when President, the Honorable Kyagulanyi, was tortured together with many people, his driver murdered, and so many such things. So that would set the stage for all the persecution that we would see later on. And as you know, under the laws of Uganda, a person who wants to run for president may carry out consultations a year to the elections. But we were not allowed to do consultations. Every time we tried to run the military, we had several meetings with the Electoral Commission of Uganda, which, as Milton said, is appointed by Museveni, and there was nothing they could do. They clearly showed that their hands were tied, and they couldn't help us. We engaged the Uganda Human Rights Commission, and that is to show that almost all institutions are under capture in our country. We engaged the Uganda Human Rights Commission, and everything else failed. We couldn't do consultations as required by the law. As you know, President is also an artist, but he was blocked from carrying out any music shows from November of 2018. And since that time, he was blocked really from attending any other functions out of Kampala. One time we went even for a wedding meeting, and then the DPC of the district came up and said, I declare this meeting illegal. A wedding that had been organized. And of course, he was blocked from attending burials and other things. All this while Museveni and his people were campaigning, going around the country. Of course, General Museveni does all this under the pretext of government programs, whatever. So he goes in a yellow shirt with all these NRM factionaries, and then they go out there do activities to try and promote themselves to a population who has clearly rejected them. And so this is what we saw. And I know that my time is really short. I wanted to remind you that at some point they banned the Red Beret. All of us saw recently one Andrew Mwenda, who is a journalist, a civilian, putting on a full military combat. And yet, up to now, as I speak, we have hundreds of our people stuck in prisons because of wearing a red beret. A red beret in many countries, in the US, everywhere, people put this on. But faced with a very, very big threat by the People Power movement, and which later morphed into NUP, the regime decided to stop this red beret because it was a symbol which many young people are using to identify themselves. So the regime decided to pass an illegal law and to, gazette the red beret, and then use that pretext to arrest so many of our people, abduct them, and do all sorts of things. You all remember that when our president went for nomination on the 3rd of November, he was arrested and violently, really, really terrible scenes. On that day, we were supposed to launch a manifesto, and he was violently arrested, picked up, and many, many people injured, including Honorable Joel Seneni and others. The regime, of course, again, faced with an imminent threat, decided to keep the campaign period too short because they did not want us to reach out to so many people. Previously, the law in Uganda provided that the campaign period should accord every presidential candidate an opportunity to go in a district, at least a district per day. And that could not happen because they gave us a very, very short time to do these campaigns. And of course, they did not expect us to do what we did. We decided to do 3 districts per day because we were really keen on covering. In some cases, we would even just spend 30 minutes in a district, immediately go to another. But you all remember what happened. The violence on the campaign trail was incredible. I personally tried to access billboards so that we would have our campaign messages out there. And all billboard companies in Kampala clearly indicated that they could not allow us, Honorable Kyagulanyi, to be anywhere because they feared that once we are allowed to advertise on billboards, the regime would immediately impose taxes and other illegal sanctions on them. So the companies are under capture, even private companies, you can imagine. Many times we tried to access radio stations for a presidential candidate to go and campaign, and we were just told Bobi Wine will not be allowed on a radio station because of the scare from the regime. What more? At one point, he was picked out and plucked out of a radio in Hoima, a radio called Spice FM. He was just, we had paid, he was supposed to start speaking, and they just came and removed him violently. Many times he was not allowed to access hotels, restaurants, and other such facilities, which, I mean, any person watching us from Europe or from this, I mean, it's horrendous to even imagine, but this is the situation we live in this country. Of course, to top it up, the violence that took place in the election would all be, would manifest in great terms between the 18th and 20th of November. We all remember that our presidential candidate was arrested in Luka, and as Ugandans tried to protest against that clearly illegal action, because you remember the regime was claiming that we are not allowed to carry out campaigns because of COVID. Yet NRM functionaries were going around carrying out big meetings. We had just finished, they had finished their primaries, NRM primaries, which actually people did by voting, I mean by lining up. That was a mode of election chosen by the NRM. So you can imagine, on one hand, you have NRM primaries where people are lining up in thousands, and that activity was allowed to go on. When the election came, and because General Museveni knew the number of people were yearning for change, the crowds that were likely to follow us, he decided to bring out COVID. And this is what we've been talking about, the double standards. Previously, they were using something called the Public Order Management Act, POMA. But now, COVID, while it was a terrible thing to many people, for Museveni, it came as a gift, a very, very huge gift. And many people think that if it was not for COVID, he wouldn't be in power. But because he decided to use COVID as a tool to control everybody, while his faction, we are moving on at some point, campaigning in churches, doing all sorts of things. So the double standards were there. And so Ugandans were right to come out in large numbers and protest between the 18th, on the 18th when our presidential candidate was arrested, and blocked because people were seeing all this that was going on. But the regime, the response from the regime was unprecedented, was not expected, I must say. People wearing sandals, others wearing towels, others in, all manner of clothing came out and started shooting Ugandan citizens indiscriminately. This included protests, and that is not to say that anybody has a right to shoot at protesters. But these people were going about their normal business. But what we saw clearly showed that there are so many people with illegal guns in this country, but because they were fighting to protect the regime, they came out and started shooting people. Definitely NUP disputes the official figure put out by the regime of 54 people, because our own account indicated that the number was much bigger than the one which was reported by the regime of the people of Uganda who were massacred in those protests. And of course, we have not seen justice at all. We've not seen anything happen to the perpetrators of this kind of violence. To date, we have people with bullets stuck in their bodies and all sorts of things. Many people know the people who shot them and who shot their relatives or who shot them and injured them, but there has been no justice whatsoever. And of course, immediately after that, the abduction started. Unbelievable. Drones, when General Museveni came, he was criticizing Obote for abductions, Pandagari, and Amin and whatever, the previous regimes, and calling them all sorts of names. But what we saw was unprecedented. They started going to villages and abducting young people in hundreds and thousands. By the time we finished the election, at least those who had reported to us were more than 3,000. But of course, we know that the numbers are even bigger, because even as I speak now, we are still discovering more people who we were not even aware of at the time, because some of these people were taken in faraway places and there was no follow-up from their relatives and they just came through. But there are also other people who were scared to come up and confess that they had been abducted, they had been tortured, because they feared that the moment they came to us, they would be captured again and such horrendous actions done on them. Milton already talked about the Facebook ban. Also, this election, one of the key things that stood out was the complete shutdown of the internet. Previous election, they're only shutting down Facebook and WhatsApp, Twitter, social media, basically. But in this election, the moment we announced You Vote, the moment our president went on the podium and announced You Vote as an app which would be used to collect DR forms, immediately they cut off the entire internet infrastructure, and you wonder where they got the results which they were reading, which definitely did not correspond with the DR forms that we later on got. So the campaign period was terrible, pre-campaign period was terrible. We came to voting day, and I can tell you that I think this was the most rigged election in history. They were not shy, to see the kind of things they did. You had the military coming in, taking ballot papers in front of everyone, in full view of cameras. And some of you must have seen most of the videos, which people were able to record and send later on when internet was restored. But, you had the military coming in, taking over polling stations, chasing away our polling agents. The day or 2 days before the elections, many of our polling agents or supervisors were arrested, were picked up and taken in by the military. The agents' letters, because once you appoint a polling agent, you should give them a letter. Those materials are confiscated by the military in many cases, and so that is the environment under which we operated. Massive ballot stuffing. If you look at the results officially released by the Electoral Commission of Uganda, you saw that in some cases, Museveni gave himself 100% of the vote. That all registered voters came up and voted. There was no one who was sick. There was no one. And that is, this is some of the evidence which we intended to file in the Electoral Commission, in the Supreme Court, when we attempted to go there. Because in some cases, like in a district called Gomba, in Isinjiro and other places, we have death certificates of people who had long died, but then you find that the regime is claiming that those people somehow resurrected and voted and died immediately, went back. You can imagine the kind of shamelessness which such a regime has. Polling agents were arrested, like I said, and it was not an election essentially. So that's why we say that by the 16th, Museveni yet again declared a coup on the people of Uganda, declared himself president without showing us at all where the results. First of all, we believe in the rule of law, and also we wanted to put the other institutions of state on the test. But the challenge that Uganda has is that all institutions of the state are under capture, including the judiciary. So all of you remember that we, for example, filed a few of the affidavits. When we tried to bring in more evidence, the Supreme Court rejected the evidence, refused to take in the evidence. So many of our affidavits were blocked, and they said, you know, we're not going to allow this evidence in. Then, before long, we tried to make an amendment to our petition, which is allowed within the law and which even the previous petition had allowed to do. When they saw the ground we're raising, because under the law, a person who has a role to play in organizing elections is not even qualified to run for president. It had come through an amendment in 2020, and somehow the regime did not take it serious until we raised it.
Thank you, David. As you look to conclude your submission, thank you.
All right, I'll conclude in a minute. But I wanted to emphasize that the reason why we actually withdrew that petition was essentially because, and in an unprecedented manner, you saw one of the justices of the Supreme Court come out to clearly disagree with what the Chief Justice was doing, or the so-called Chief Justice Owinidolo was doing, and clearly saying that the manner in which the entire case was being handled was illegal, was immoral, and was definitely wrong. So that is a situation that happened. Of course, today we will call the patriots. We will remember the young people who are in prisons. Today, I went with Mama Lina and other comrades to Chitalia to see how people were blocked from seeing these are comrades. The prison authorities came up with some funny excuses and blocked us from seeing people. But I want to mention here that we still have hundreds of people under illegal detention over election-related matters. And we call upon the world to stand in solidarity with Uganda, and not just, and we are grateful to America and other countries which have clearly indicated more is done to make sure that there's accountability for the crimes against humanity, and also that Ugandans are able to have their voices respected. I thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So before we move to the next speaker, who is going to be Dr. Lina Zadriga, a very quick question to you, David. And we are trying to keep it moving quickly. So you have a minute to respond to this. No more than a minute. Yep. Is the party keeping a good record of all the people who are coming in and making the reports of being kidnapped, being tortured, including of deaths? Because obviously this could form the basis of a report that would help in bringing the regime to accountability in the future. And then the second question is this: Uganda depends primarily on the EU countries and the United States for its survival, the regime. What specifically would the party like to be seen done that is already not being done by the EU countries and the United States in its relationship with the regime?
Thank you so much. You've given me a minute. So one, the party is keeping records. It's been very difficult to, I must say, because the regime was going for a lot of these things, trying to confiscate them, etc. But we've devised means to ensure that, for example, Bruce is here, who is handling the ICC case and all that, and everything that comes in, he has a record of it. Of course, there is a lot more, and so we're trying within our means to keep record of whatever comes in terms of the records, and making sure that there's accountability at the end of the day. The second question, I think the EU and indeed the developed world needs to stop funding our operation. Simple, just stop funding our operation. We've seen sanctions, clear sanctions imposed on governments which are repressive, which abuse human rights, which torture people with impunity. And we're saying that there should be strong measures against the regime in Uganda, including sanctions targeting individuals, but also sanctions targeting the regime or the government, as they love to call it. So we'd love to see more of that, but we also would love to see more outspokenness on the part of the leaders in Europe and these other countries coming up to say that you are illegitimate. Let Ugandans have a free and fair election. Let democracy prevail. So that's, I think that's what we're asking for.
Okay.
And of course,
right.
justice for the victims. And that's extremely important, not only the ICC, but also other mechanisms within the world, the Magnitsky and others, to ensure that, you know, because like I already said, the judiciary in Uganda cannot hold these people accountable. That is why we look to outside sources to be able to hold these perpetrators accountable.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we now go to Dr. Lina Zedriga, the National Unity Platform Party Vice President. The floor is yours, Dr. Zedriga.
Host is not allowing me. Yeah, good afternoon, good evening. This 14th day of January 2022, which is 1 year after an election that took the semblance of fully fledged military operation from the beginning up to the end. I want to thank David and also Professor Milton and your team for hosting us this afternoon and for making us to reflect 1 year after the militarized, monetized, I don't know what else I could even say. The level of impunity I had never seen in any election. It had gone to the next level. However, the words of Steve Maraboli gives me resilience that life doesn't get easier or more forgiving. We get stronger and more resilient. And that's exactly, Professor Milton and your group, what you're allowing us to portray. We have gotten more resilient. Because from the onset, it was pronounced by Museveni and the team that we would not, there would be no opposition, there would be no. However, from the time we actually first, when the president, our president, the elected president of Uganda, His Excellency Robert Kyagulanyi, announced his intention to run, that was when hell was let loose. Hell was let loose. And then we were continuously portrayed as, you know, unserious and stuff. But we grew stronger and stronger because the whole of Uganda and beyond, people wanted the change and they still want change. And we are in power, by the way. We are. Because when we move in the communities, the way people are, please stay strong. Please, Mama, we are here together. We are going to ensure that our stolen victory is rightfully, you know, handed. My experience that I share one year after the militarized election is we managed to demystify two things. The 35 years that Museveni has been in power, stealing elections, telling lies, was the buying. You know, for a long time, people have been bought off, targeted and bought off. But this time it failed. We demystified that. The second thing we demystified was the fear. People were so inspired, and we want to thank our president for that, because wherever he went, he really, through his songs, he was very inspirational, and the young people came out and showed the world that it is time for change and the change is going to come. I did not specifically expect that they would degenerate to the blatant, I don't want to be so, to the blatant robbery. Because this hour, 5 p.m., I was in Gulu hearing all these calls. Mama, they're here. These people want, the military have taken over. They want the declaration forms. Throughout that night, I was getting calls. They followed the declaration forms up to the tally centers. We also got information, and even we have documented where those polling agents in Ubongi, in Yumbe, who did not surrender the declaration forms to the military, were tied to stones and thrown in River Nile. They were thrown. That is how brutal they were. Prior to that, scores of our candidates were approached to be bought off. And when they refused, they were threatened with abductions. Our candidate, Honorable Haddad Salim, Arua municipality, Opingopi, and the scores of them were abducted on the 10th, which was a Sunday, tortured throughout, injected with whatever things, and thrown in South Sudan border on the 14th of January, when there was now so much pressure. Candidates abducted because they refused to be bought. Where do you ever hear this? And the elections, still people voted, by the way, very, very, very unanimously. People voted so much for Haddad, to the extent that in the election results for Arua municipality, when they were announced and the current member of parliament, NRM, was announced, he himself was surprised. He was surprised. Candidates who knew they had failed, who knew they had no popularity, but they were announced as the winners. That is how blatant the impunity went. And up to even post-election, many had to leave and run away because they were still being intimidated to destroy evidence. And the brokers would even come and swipe how much so-and-so, you know, who has been in your camp or who has been in opposition. We have brokered this one 600 million, but for your other candidate, we just want, 800 million. A long list, so the level of impunity, whether it is the attempted, and then the propaganda, just to break our hearts, to break us. And then the attack on family members, targeted. It is continuing up to today. My call to Ugandans, we must speak out. We must have our own list of the attempts, whether it is the militarization, the monetization. Then the abductions were so militarized. I was abducted myself. We were actually supposed to be traversing the 3 districts per day. From Patch, we were supposed to be going to, from Oyam, we were supposed to be going to Apache, and then would end up in Lira. Lo and behold, we were abducted midway. And this was to derail the campaign by the military. I was thrown in a cell with men, 11th of November. Not only that, the presidential campaign team, the A team, the entire team, from his personal security bodyguards to the press, were all abducted by military. Young girls, young women. Some of them, their only weapon were cameras, Lukman, and dumped in a military. The horrific experiences they have gone through. You cannot believe this was an election. You can't. Even the most barbaric person would not subject their citizens, young citizens, to that. They wouldn't. But this, when we speak about it, it's like it was in a very badly acted movie. The horrific torture, the drones, all have continued, by the way, up to today, whether it is the intimidation, whether it is the propaganda, whether it is the attempted buying, whether it is what, now they are boasting. You know, this was you thought you were the best, now we have so and so, now we have actually going for the families. It is so real. Shutdown of the media was very real. And using the COVID-19 rule as a rule by law, we were charged of intentionally spreading the COVID-19 with my team of 4 in Ilira court. We still go to court. The president and other candidates were arraigned in all kinds of sham proceedings in court before the military court martial. And when you are PM before the military court martial, you are intimidated. So, I mean, we have a lot to celebrate, but we also owe it to those who passed on, who were murdered. We owe it to those who are still in jail. We owe it to the dead and unborn. And we call upon the world. We will not stop to pursue our victory that was rigged, that was stolen. We will not stop to cleanse our country that is riddled with bloodshed, that is riddled with lies, that is total. And where a country where the president will come out and reward one of the people, for example, the Speaker of Parliament, who said, you know, I'm the one who knew, who made sure NUP did not have, NUP offices were raided, we were beaten, and so on. So I need to be rewarded.
Dr. Lena, thank you so much. Just reminding you, you have 1 minute left. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, you know, 1 year, 1 minute. I am very excited. I am very grateful that we are making, recollecting this, not from a position of powerlessness, but from a position of power. We are using it to reclaim our dignity, our voice. We are using it to let the world know our president elected de facto, de jure, is His Excellency, Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu. And we will not rest until he is in power.
Thank you, Dr. Zedriga. I also have a quick question for you before we move to the next speaker. And you also have 1 minute to respond to this. You have spoken about how the election has demystified or disrobed the regime and exposed it to the world in terms of how it stole the election and its brutality. So a person listening to you from the outside could then come to this conclusion. Will elections ultimately expose the regime sufficiently to remove the regime from power, or will it take something else? How would you respond to this question?
Thank you so much. Where we see the power of the people so feared now by this, elections will definitely, because the power of the people has shaken this junta so much. What we are left actually is to ensure that the resilience continues, the resilience and the mobilization continues. He is actually very afraid. That's why he wants to keep away from proper elections. Now they're even bringing that it will be election of president will be in parliament. He has feared the power of the people, the power of the masses. So yes, I am very convinced we, through our vote, through protecting it, through resilience, through failing to be, we will definitely remove the junta.
Okay, thank you. We will have a slight amendment to the program. Instead of Robert Kyagulanyi, aka Bobby Wine, speaking at this point, we are going to call up Joel Sonyanji instead, and he is the spokesperson of the National Unity Platform Party. So Joel, the floor is now yours. Do we have Joel available?
Joel, you should be unmuted. Please let us know if you can speak, and we'll know if you can hear us.
I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Is Joel available?
Hey, Joel, please speak up a bit louder. We can hear you, but it's a bit faint. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if this is better. Let me get.
I thought I'd seen a note from Joel that he's available to speak.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We can, but the volume is low. If you could speak a bit closer to the mic or raise the volume. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, so at this point, if we cannot get Joel, we have to make a quick decision whether we should go to the Q&A
Milton.
now. We can actually bring up Bruce.
We have Joel. We're just trying to sort out his sound. His volume is quite low.
Okay. I've put off the audio.
Okay, there we go.
That my sound is good enough.
Please unmute yourself.
Milton and Tim, can you hear me?
Joel Senyonyi, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, that's better. We could do with a bit more, but we should be able to make out what you're saying if you can speak through that. Thank you.
Okay, I've tried to change location. I'll probably put off the video so that my audio can be clearer. Is that fine with you?
That's absolutely fine.
Actually, the video would be good because I don't think it's a connection problem.
Okay, let's see how this goes. Let me know if there are any significant challenges. I've just tried to change the location here. Oh, very quickly, you see what happened in Kayunga, really the upside of what happened on
David, can you hear Joel?
We've lost his sound again. I'm so sorry. Apologies. We seem to have issues with getting Joel's sound, so we can't hear him. Joel,
we're having some technical difficulties with you. Perhaps we'll try to get him in the second half. David, I hand it over to you to get some questions from members of the press.
Thank you, Milton. Like Milton said, would now like to take first batch of questions from the members of the press. As you heard, David Lewis Rubungoya, who's the Secretary General of NUP, spoke, and Dr. Lina, who's the Deputy President in charge of the Northern Region. Those members of the press who would like to ask questions to those specific speakers, please could you raise your hands up so that we can take your questions. We'll give priority to members of the press, and should, for whatever reason, we not have questions from you, we will then move on to the general plenary questions whilst we wait for our next batch of speakers. Thank you so much. So please could you use the options on your Zoom to raise your hands up. Can we make sure you introduce yourself, tell us which media house you're calling from, phrase your question you get 1 minute to phrase your question, but also let us know who the question is addressed to. Thank you. Okay, I think we have a question here from Juan. Juan, please, could you unmute yourself, introduce yourself, tell us where you're calling from, what media house you represent, who the question is directed to, and you get 1 minute to phrase your question. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, I'm not a journalist. I'm not from any media house. I'm just a concerned citizen.
In the process that we're waiting for the media houses to raise their questions, please, can we...
David, we have a journalist available, so I think we should give priority to Liam Taylor, who is a freelance journalist, indicated that he wanted to ask some question. Liam, you are unmuted. Can you please ask your question?
Thank you, Nico.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. I'm a freelance journalist based in Kampala, writing for international media. 2 questions. Firstly, according to the Electoral Commission's results, which obviously should be taken with a pinch of salt, turnout was very low in Kampala. Do you think turnout was low in Kampala, and if so, why? And secondly, last year, about a month after the elections, NUP said that your candidate won 54% of the vote in presidential elections. I'm wondering where the evidence is for that. I've asked the Secretary General before for some kind of spreadsheet or something showing polling station level data. I've not seen that. Even in the rigged report, it states that the uvote team haven't seen the evidence to support the 54% claims. So where is that evidence and how can we see it?
Thank you, Liam, for your question. We'll direct those questions to David Lewis. David Lewis, if you're available, please could you unmute yourself and answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liam. The first question is about the voter turnout. I actually think the voter turnout in this election was not as we had expected. It was definitely not as high as we wanted it to be. First of all, because of the cloud of fear and the intimidation, especially after the massacre in November. Very, very many people feared to even come out and vote, and we've seen this not only in the general election, but you saw what happened in Kayunga. People were literally not able to come out and vote in the numbers that we thought they would be coming in, simply because of the level of intimidation. Where these armored vehicles and all these mambas, military trucks, are moving around the towns. In such an environment, definitely you expect people not to turn up in big numbers. But secondly, there's something which the regime systematically does, and we've been tracing this, and I believe it's in the rigged report, but also in other, in all these past election reports. In some cases, if you look at the voter turnout for the members of parliament, for example, it's always higher than the presidential election. And in some cases, the Electoral Commission officials have always brought down the number of votes, for example, which people at the member of parliament level have gotten, so as to justify the low voter turnout. Especially, and if you also compare to districts where Museveni allegedly performs better, you see that the voter turnout is always much, much, much higher than where the people who are opposing him come from. So I'll give you an example. If you see the figures, you'll already see that Kampala, Wakiso, whatever, they try to bring the voter turnout to be very, very low. But in places like Chiruhura, Isinjiro, Gomba, and other places where they can easily rig, you find that the voter turnout, like I said, in some cases, you'll find them saying that the voter turnout was 100% at certain polling stations. So that's what I can comment on that. The second thing, we clearly told you, and we clearly indicated that we had about 25,000, more than 25,000 BR forms, which we still have in our possession. Those are the ones we used to complete the 54.19%. And with regard to the other percentage, we rely on the Electoral Commission results themselves. What happened after the election? Those about 9,000 DR forms which we do not have, it is because many of our people were abducted. In some cases, of course, like I already said, polling agents were taken off the polling stations, etc., etc. But even other people had gathered, for example, a gentleman called Oyek Gerald, who had our DR forms from northern Uganda, from the entire sub-region of Acholi, was picked up. Up to now, those DR forms are still in the possession of the police and the military. If you look at, there are many others, and some of these people came out in the open. So this evidence is available. What we wanted to do at some point, you remember, the data was voluminous. But even then, we attempted to load it on our website, and the website was immediately attacked. And maybe that's something I did not talk about initially when I was making a presentation, that one of the tools which the regime used this time was to attack most of the social media accounts or pages, which we were using because they knew that in some cases we were able to use VPN and all that to access them. And, many Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts, including those official accounts of the National Unity Platform, were taken down by the regime. And that's what happened to the website when we tried to put up this data. But these records are available. We can photocopy them. They are voluminous. That's what I must say. And then you go and do your own analysis.
Thank you, David. I see Liam's got his hand up, perhaps to clarify on the question, or maybe just elaborate on his question a bit more. So, Liam, did you want to follow up on your question?
Yeah. Thanks, Lewis. That's all clear. But my particular point is that in order to add up all of those 25,000 DR forms you do have, you must have created some kind of spreadsheet with data per polling station for what you believe to be the results from the DR forms that you did manage to collect. Now that spreadsheet won't be a large file, it will just be a spreadsheet of some kind, I guess. So where is that? Can you share that? Can you put it up publicly? Because I've only seen a district level breakdown so far, and it would be useful.
We do have that.
It would be useful to have that make direct comparisons to the EC's reported results.
Thank you so much, Liam. We do have that. We actually what we released at the time was the one showing the districts, the performance per district, and we are going to release the one which has the specific polling stations. But we already released the one which had per district how we fared in each district, and therefore how did we compute the 54.19%. So I'll ask our team to work on that, and definitely I can pass it on to you.
Thank you, David. We've got two people who've raised up their hands, but they've not got proper names. So given the fact that we're trying to ensure that we get this completed to time, if you can't use a proper name, we won't ask you to ask a question. And I'll hand over to my host, Milton, to move on to the next batch of speakers. Thank you so much.
Okay, very good. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right, so have we determined definitely that these individuals are not members of the media? They've refused to identify themselves, is that it?
Yes, just for security reasons, if members decide not to use proper names, we are almost certain that they are not keen to engage in a civil manner, so we'll proceed until we get proper names. Thank you so much.
Okay, very good. So at this point, we go to the second batch of speakers then. Let's try again to see if we can get Joel Senyonji, if perhaps the audio quality has improved. He is the spokesperson for the National Unity Platform. Joel Senyonji, can we give it one more try?
All right, Professor Milton, can you hear me loud and clear?
Joel, we're still struggling to hear you. You might need to raise your voice a lot louder on the microphone that you're using. Thank you.
Okay, how is it now? Is it much clearer?
That's better. That's better.
Okay, I'll try and do without the video so that the audio does not get disrupted. So what I was trying to say earlier on is that Kayunga, what happened in Kayunga is really a subset of what happened on 14th January 2021.
I'm very sorry, Joel, to interrupt. For many of our participants who may not be familiar with Kayunga, I'll just briefly tell them what that was. Thank you.
That's all right. So we just had a by-election for LC5 chairperson of a district called Kayunga. Now, the occupant of the office who belonged to NUP died under very mysterious circumstances. We believe he was taken out of action. And so there gets to be a by-election. So NUP fronts another candidate and of course other political parties, including the NRM. Now, on the eve of the election, Mr. Museveni said, and that video made rounds, he said, NRM is the one that determines what should happen. You know, if NRM says something should be, it will be, and that kind of thing. And he was clearly pointing to the election. So the election gets to happen. Lots of things did transpire. Voting legally in Uganda begins at 7 a.m. But as our agents and other keen residents of the district got to polling stations at around 6 a.m., they found ballot boxes full. And the Electoral Commission of officials hoodwinked them to say, well, people came early as 5 a.m. and they began to vote. Ridiculous, because that's even against the law. Voting should begin at 7 a.m. But that was clear ballot stuffing. But even with the ballot stuffing that happened, we collected DR forms, declaration of results forms. That's what shows the results per polling station. And according to the DR forms which we have from the entire district, which were signed, by the way, by Electoral Commission officials. Those are called presiding officials. They were signed by agents of the NUP candidate and the NRM candidate. Those DR forms, they show that our candidate won the election by over 15,000 votes. The EC officials conceded, that's why they signed. The NRM candidate conceded, that's why his agent signed. But Mr. Museveni said, no, we must declare our winner, that is the NRM winner. And that's what happened, broad daylight thuggery. We have our DR forms, which show that we clearly won, and that's why we decided to go to court, to test the court process too, problematic as it might be. So that's just a snapshot of what happened on 14 January 2021. The brutality, the rigging in a manner so wanton, etc., etc. But you see, an election is not an event. And this is in, several jurisprudence. Of course, here in Uganda and other jurisdictions, it's been determined. An election is not just an event, it is a process. An election begins as far back as, in our case, consultations. Our constitution provides for consultations for anybody that is desirous to become president of Uganda. And so Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu, Bobi Wine, set out to hold consultations in January of 2020. That time, there was no lockdown in our country, which has been used, to brutalize our people and so on. But Museveni said, no, Bobi Wine shall not go to the people. And we said, but the constitution provides for this. So we told the Electoral Commission, which way forward? The Electoral Commission said, well, the constitution says you can have consultations, so go and hold them. You go to the field, we were arrested, brutalized, and all of that. And Mr. Museveni said, no, Bobi Wine will not go out to the people to hold consultations. And yet they are allowable within the law. So that was problem number one. And then you get to campaigns. On nomination day, we were beaten, and David Lewis talked about this issue. Our candidate was...
Joel? Joel, I think we are losing you. Joel, can you hear us? That's too bad. He was giving us a good summary. Until we fix the tech issue with Joel, I suggest we move to the next speaker. Is Bruce Afran available?
We are going to need, I think, 2 minutes more to have Bruce online.
Okay, very good. And then after Bruce, we will have the final president, the president himself speak, and then he will be the final speaker. So at this point, I guess we could go back to David Lewis. Is David Lewis still with us?
Yes.
Is David Lewis still with us? David, so as Secretary General, I think you're on mute, David. Could you unmute yourself? You're on mute, David.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Very good. Now, as Secretary General, obviously one of your main functions is to mobilize the supporters, the grassroots supporters of the party. And the question is this: if you're not able to bring people out, if you're not able to have the president of the party address the party supporters because of the illegal roadblocks and setups and restrictions that the regime puts up, how do you function?
Of course, it's very difficult, and it's incredible, and that's one of the reasons why we keep saying that all of us should aim at removing the dictatorship first of all, so that we can, for example, have political parties function in this country. And that is why, for example, the NUP decided not to join a platform called IPOD, the Interparty Organization for Dialogue, where General Museveni likes to come and claim that he's talking to the opposition, claim that there's dialogue, claim that there's multi-party democracy, where you have members of parliament like Honorable Segirinya and Honorable Alan Sewanyana in jail, and their trial has really not started. There's no evidence that is being brought forth to pin them. But most importantly, that you cannot mobilize, you cannot carry out activities. That General Museveni uses two things. He uses money and uses the stick or the gun in this particular case. So if he throws money
sorry
at,
to interrupt. Bruce is online now and he only has 8 minutes. Shall we go to him?
Okay.
Okay, David, just wrap up in a second.
Oh, no, thank you. I
think my point has been made already.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Bruce then.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Oh, my apologies. I actually have until 10:15 Eastern time. That was perhaps my confusion. I have another court matter at that time. But if you'd like me to speak now, I can, Nico.
Yes, please. The floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everyone, or good morning if you're in the U.S. I'm Bruce Safran. I'm the attorney or one attorney for the NUP and Robert Chagalani, or Bobby Wine, as you may know him. And I work with David Lewis, who is the General Secretary of the NUP and also an esteemed attorney in his own right. We are pending, as you know, a request for a complaint to be initiated by the International Criminal Court. That complaint was filed last year. It is very detailed. We followed it up with a supplement that contains additional allegations of massive human rights violations. Many of you know what they are. Some of you on this call have been victims of those. And it demonstrates a pattern of continuing abuse by the regime, not only in terms of corrupted elections, which one might expect, but in absolute abuse of basic human rights of people. And we have demonstrated to the court, and again, they must determine for themselves these facts, gross injuries and abuses of prisoners, electric scarring from wires, gouging of flesh, chemicals put into people's eyes, the packing of human beings in cells with 50 to 100 people, food only once a day, often missing meals, held months in these conditions, cigarette burns literally all over bodies, many people killed, many people dying in these circumstances. These conditions have sadly continued, and there have been continued roundups of opposition, not only opposition figures and officials, but ordinary citizens who've displayed some sympathy to the political opposition, which is actually the political majority in Uganda, as we know. And the regime has continued to engage in these activities. Recently, in the most recent by-election, I believe that was Kayunga, please correct me, David Lewis, if I'm incorrect. In the most recent by-election, not only was the Honorable Chagalani put under house arrest with his family and 2 staff members to prevent him from speaking at the final rallies, the candidate herself was severely beaten. As you know, a leading member of parliament in the opposition was hospitalized because of his injuries. And dozens of other people were abused physically, both at the event and following arrests. This conduct, has continued despite warnings from the US. In fact, these actions took place at the by-election 1 week after the US announced sanctions as to Uganda's military intelligence chief. And so this demonstrates that the regime has believed that it can proceed with some degree of impunity. Now, they seem to recognize some limits, of course. And part of this is because they believe China may be their savior. But they've recently found that China now has a lock on Uganda's sovereign property in its airport. And I think Uganda is going to realize it needs to be with the US. And we're seeing in Uganda a little bit of demonstration of what happens when governments think they can side with a dictatorship such as the Chinese. Gradually, though, I think African nations are recognizing that they need to be with the West, and China is not the answer for them. Until that fully happens in Uganda, we are going to continue to see human rights abuses on a large scale. Now, we will be going back to the International Criminal Court sometime in February, I don't have the exact date yet, with a submission of approximately 100 signed witness statements that are signed and notarized of people who have been imprisoned in Museveni's prison system, who have been abused physically, in many cases tortured. In many cases, these statements describe the actual torture. This is a major step in, as Honorable Chagalani says, bringing down a dictator. Because we now have signed statements from people who are willing to go on record with the court, identifying what has happened. We even have statements indicating direct relationship of the general's son, Muhoozi, to these operations. And this will be evidence that directly ties the general and his son to these physical abuses and tortures. All of this violates international law. It all violates Ugandan law. And let me say this. In the end, there is no impunity for a dictator. If you remember what happened after the East German government fell, the East German leaders were put on trial for shooting people at the wall because that violated German law. Ultimately, Museveni's actions violate Uganda law, and ultimately he and his leadership will have to face those criminal charges because the worm always turns. And the law of Uganda exists, and it will ultimately be used to achieve justice. And we believe the International Criminal Court, seeing these statements, will continue its inquiries. And the international community will be alerted with actual evidence signed by witnesses as to these abuses. I hope that gives a good summary of where we are legally. I am here if anyone has any questions. As I mentioned, I'll have to leave in 1 hour's time for a court hearing in another matter. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for that, Bruce. I have a quick question that maybe will take a minute or two to respond to. You noted the sanctions against General Abel Kandiho, the commander of the 15th of Military Intelligence, CMI, sanctions by the Treasury Department of the United States. He is personally accused of personally participating in some of the torture, including sexual torture and the killings. So the question is, were the sanctions against him sufficient, number one? And number two, if the regime still responds by literally ignoring it and conducting the abuses carried out during the Kayunga by-elections, what else could be done then in that case? That's the first question. The second question is related to the ICC, because as you know, the ICC is also sometimes influenced by the international politics. And sometimes people that deserve to be indicted are protected. How do you read the current political environment? Do you think there's still any entity that would sort of try to protect or shield General Museveni? Those are the two questions.
Thank you. If the host wants me to, I will address those now. Are they directed to me?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Almadi. The two questions really are, one, what more can be done by the U.S. or is the U.S. effective if these actions are ignored? And secondly, what is the political interaction with the International Criminal Court? Let me address the second question first. I'm a lawyer and I'm always given this question, and it's really a universal issue in every legal system. is there outside influence on the judges? And do the judges care about the case that comes before them? As a lawyer, I have to have confidence and belief in the honesty and integrity of a court, because otherwise I can't function. I can't function if I believe a court is corrupted. I'll say this, there is no reason to believe the International Criminal Court acts other than in the interests of justice as it sees it. There may be times when their decisions look political. For example, recently the court announced it would investigate Israeli actions in certain Palestinian areas. And to some people, that seems like it's an anti-Zionist attitude and a pro-Palestinian attitude. But I think it's really a question of how the prosecutor sees the extent of their jurisdiction. I don't think we can interpret that as political or biased. And I think this analysis has to apply across the board. It's very easy to look at it and say, well, they have political influence. I don't think so. The court has acted in many different types of cases. The thing is, the court is a relatively small body, and it can only prosecute a certain number of matters. And I think that's really the deciding factor. So I hope that answers the second question. As to the first question, remember something, the United States is a notoriously patient country. We work in small steps, and we build a record going forward. So the US brought sanctions against the intelligence chief. To some degree, they were disregarded when we saw the actions at the by-election. However, that's not the end of the US involvement. The US is testing to see how Museveni responds. I can assure you the US will not leave the matter that way. There will be further and further actions by the US government. Now, there are limits, of course, to what the US can do. But the Biden administration is relatively new and was new then, and it's seeing where things will go. In a great sense, the more abuses Museveni undertakes, the stronger the international community's position against him will be. So part of the US strategy is to issue these clear warnings, and when Museveni disobeys them, disregards them, that adds to the case ultimately against him. So I hope that answers the question from the legal diplomatic point of view.
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So at this point, we would like to see if the party president is available. Robert Kyagulanyi, aka Bobby Wine. My co-host, do you know if Bobby Wine is now available?
We are still looking for him. And may I also take this opportunity to ask the question raisers, Enid and John and Mamadou, all of them, please put in the chat which media you are with. People from the media will be given priority. Maybe Milton, while we are identifying the president, you have another question for Bruce?
I think Bruce answered most of my questions. I actually had one other thought. Bruce, you spoke about the witnesses that are now willing to publicly speak to the crimes that they have suffered by the regime. Have some of them made video or audio recordings? Because as I'm listening, I'm thinking they would be quite compelling if they could actually address a press conference as well. And given the reality on the ground in Uganda, they may have to be outside the country should they address such a press conference. Have you given some consideration to this?
Well, actually, this is something that I've coordinated with the relevant authorities at the NUP, including David Lewis. Let me answer it this way. We do have some videotapes. Quite frankly, though, we are going to disclose those names to the International Criminal Court.
Understood.
We will proceed a little more cautiously with public disclosure of the witnesses' names for the reasons that are obvious.
Of course.
You know, as a lawyer, I feel a responsibility, you know, to protect people's safety also. So I don't know about releasing videos in that way because we're somewhat concerned about retaliation.
Understood.
You know, and now one thing I think the government probably would be a little reluctant to retaliate against a witness who's come forward because then it's clearly an act against due process. But we have to be a little cautious in that direction. But I appreciate that thought. We will give more thought to that.
Thank you. Okay, I now turn it back to my co-host, David Steele, and the media questions from the media.
Thank you. Thank you, Milton, for that session. Like we did before, would like you to have the opportunity to ask questions, and like Dr. Nico mentioned, would give priority to members of the media houses. So if you're a member of the media house, please raise your hands and let us know what media house you represent before we give you the opportunity to ask questions. That said, we will give the general attendees the opportunity to ask questions after that. So Mamadou Niang, I see you have your hand up. Can you just introduce yourself and confirm what media house you represent, if you do represent a media house?
Mamadou is on mute.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon for the sisters and brothers overseas. So, well, thank you for doing this. Thank you for this platform. My name is Mamadou Niang, and I'm with Next Media, a television news agency based in New York City. I think this question is for, all of those involved actually in the proceedings, in the elections, and also Bruce, the attorney. So in the expectation and the anticipation of an unfair election, could you tell us what created the situation where the international election monitoring system has not performed? Also, I would like to understand, and I am from French colonial speaking part of the continent. And you can see sometimes when there are this kind of situation, whether in Mali very recently or in Guinea as recently as well, you can hear voices, you can hear some solidarity, across West Africa. Now, how do we understand insufficient solidarity with neighboring countries of Uganda? And we would also like to know if you have any update on the situation of Kakwenza. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamadou. I think we'll ask David to respond to the question, and we'll give Bruce will give you a chance to respond to the question as well and add what you have. David, please, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, yes, please, I can hear you.
Did you get the question?
Yeah, I think I got the question. I think the question he was asking is whether the countries neighboring Uganda are in solidarity with our struggle.
Yeah, so that was the second one. The first one was in anticipation of the rigging of the elections. What explanation do you have for the international election monitoring system not coming into play?
Okay, well, first of all, you remember that election monitors were blocked from observing the election in January. You had the European Union election observers blocked by the regime, and they came up and issued a statement that they were not invited, which should have been the first step. And then you had the United States embassy in Uganda releasing a statement indicating that they were not going to be able to observe the election because the regime had denied them accreditation. And that happened also to, several international media houses. You remember that very, very many international media houses were denied accreditation. and they didn't have permission basically to stay in Uganda and to cover the election. So we had a few, election monitors, but the usual suspects. You had the IGAD, East African Community. I mean, people whose democratic credentials cannot be, talked about at all. Those are the only ones who are allowed, the African Union, etc., etc. And of course, you saw the kind of statements they issued. But credible election monitors were blocked from monitoring the general election, which is an extremely serious matter if you want to look at what a free and fair election ought to look like. Maybe to the other question, we, of course, in terms of the people, many people across the East African region, and indeed Africa, stand in solidarity with our cause. I think one of the things that we have achieved as People Power and NUP is that the whole world now knows that Uganda is ruled by a tyrant, by a military dictator, and that's very important. So in terms of the people, you get to see that. In terms of governments, I must say that, of course, given the nature of the regime here, having been very, very keen on exporting wars and all sorts of things, they have not been as strong to come out. They've not made very, very strong statements as we saw with ECOWAS, but I believe the time will come when that will happen. Hopefully it will happen soon.
Thank you, David. Bruce, did you have anything to add to what David has said?
I do want to add, excuse me, that at the time of the election a year ago, we need to remember the government had also imposed a complete internet blackout on the country.
Right.
And this hampered the efforts to gather the data that was available. In addition, the government locked the NUP offices and raided locations where NUP documents were stored. And so this interfered with the ability to manifest evidence about corrupted elections. So in addition to what David said, that the government actually blocked observers from entering and actually would not give sufficient visas to US observers, the government acted in a way to prevent the NUP and other parties from gathering the evidence that existed. Now, we had a lot, but the government used the internet blackout and the raid on party offices to interfere with the evidence gathering process. So that's another example of the basic illegality of the government's actions. And all of this violates not only international law, but Ugandan law. And let me remind you that even Uganda is not a lost cause. On the Supreme Court, one justice stood out and condemned the majority's decision and insisted that she would go forward with a case challenging the election. And even though they cut the power and closed the courtroom, she reopened it and held an international news conference stating her views and reciting her opinion. And there are many judges in Uganda who feel that way. And no legal system is without its merits. So ultimately, I think the legal system will come around. But we have to continue this international pressure. I believe that Uganda is respecting some limits because of this pressure, because of these international actions, and because of meetings such as this. And so we need to remember that in ending a dictatorial regime, there are many intangible factors, and the pressure that's constantly placed on it is one of them. And that will eventually bring out the better aspects that are waiting to be used in Uganda as well. But I do want to note, I think the EU, before the election, announced it was going to pull out some its observers because it felt the government would not permit them to function correctly. So some of what David referred to, I think, had to do with the EU's prior experience in Uganda in the previous election. David may correct me if I'm incorrect on that.
Thank you.
Bruce, I want to add to that. In fact, the EU did issue a comprehensive report after the election that it previously observed, and none of the recommendations, including a level playing field for all the parties, including an independent electoral commission, none of those recommendations were undertaken by the regime. Go ahead,
Right,
David.
I think that's one. I think, if I may say, that's one of the reasons the EU initially would not send observers this time around, if I'm correct.
Correct.
And then the US, as David said, was denied entry.
Correct. David Steele?
Thank you. Dr. Nico, did you have a question that you wanted to raise?
I have two questions. First of all, I have a question for our user BBK Bobby. We want to know if you are just Bobby's fan or if you are really Bobby Wine, because I got a message from Bobby that he is suffering from a really bad connection. That is why we are still trying to get him on. If we have him online, he will just speak to you probably shortly because his connection is so bad. And all of us know why his connection is so bad, right? Then I have, for the moment, I have a question for Bruce. The last week, we have obviously, all of us, been worried about Kakwenza very much. And we finally got an, how you call that, indictment that he is being held for offensive tweets, clearly specifying the tweets of Muhoozi and Museveni. According to your opinion, does that also mean that Muhoozi or Museveni is behind his arrest?
Well, I think it's clear that the so-called General Muhoozi is intimately connected with the system of arrests and detention in Uganda and is supervising them through his own unit. Let me comment on the nature of those charges. It violates the Computer Use Act in Uganda, the indictment says. And it says it does so by disturbing the peace of President Museveni. That's actually the phrase in the indictment, that the tweets disturb the peace of the president. Now, that is not an offense under Uganda law or any other legal system. It really is an invention and abuse of the law. You know, this is what regimes like this do. They create charges, use them as a pretext to detain someone. Months later, when they know it could not go through even a corrupted court, they quietly release the person, but after the harm has been done. But honestly, this is not even an offense under Ugandan law or any other legal system. It is simply a contrived pretext to detain someone who has opposed the regime. But obviously, they can't detain everyone who sends out tweets. So this type of strategy can be countered by more tweets.
Yes.
And we counter this by expanding speech and using those rights that exist. Uganda can shut down its internet, or ultimately will have to tolerate these criticisms. So, you know, the populace of Uganda can respond to this by simply sending out more tweets. And ultimately, they're not going to be able to arrest thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. But let me add this. Let me just be definitive. David, I'm sure, would agree as a lawyer, there is no legal basis for this detention.
Hello, President. How are you doing? Yes.
Thank you, Bruce, for that response to the question raised. Whilst we wait for Nico to get to
I have Bobby on the line.
Okay.
And I think I will be able to get him in 1 minute. If you have time for a short question, then I will identify him. Thank you.
Oh, we have him here.
They said I'll get him in a minute. If you have a question, there you go.
Ask to unmute.
Great to see you, President. Just unmute and take your time, because this is what we were waiting for.
Thank you very much, Nico. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, friends, wherever you are in the world. Kindly bear with my connection as I'm traveling from a barrio of one of the noble industrialists in the country. Thank you very much for hosting us as we make a year after the bloodiest election in Uganda, after the most fraudulent election that took place in Uganda. It's unfortunate that up to today, General Museveni continues to abuse rights. Hundreds of young people continue to be in illegal incarceration without trial and certainly without a crime. But we are here. Now that we are here, I find it important to communicate to the whole world to know the kind of dictatorial regime that we are grappling under, to know the kind of military tyrant that General Museveni is. We might not have been announced as winners. The people of Uganda might have their voice usurped by General Museveni, but at least we know that we were able to put it in the face of the entire world, to know that democracy is being stifled. Unfortunately, democracy is being stifled under the sponsorship of the world's renowned democracies. We continue to call upon the international community to treat Uganda and the people of Uganda as other citizens of the world, to make democracy and the rule of law preconditions for cooperation with Uganda, and not to continue sponsoring terror in Uganda, state-inspired terror. And I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much, Nico, for hosting us.
Bobby Wine? Bobby Wine, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, please.
Very good. This is Milton. Thank you for taking the time to address us. I have the same question for you that I had for David. What would NUP like the EU countries and the United States to do that is not being done at this time?
First and foremost, we would like the EU and the United States not to associate with injustice, not to associate with tyrants and dictatorship, but most importantly, to stop sponsoring it. We are aware, they are aware that a lot of European citizens' taxpayers' money, a lot of American citizens' taxpayers' money is going into sponsoring what is supposed to be military engagements, but unfortunately, it is the oppression of the people of Uganda. We want the international community to stop sponsoring terror in Uganda, because what they're sponsoring is terror, what they're sponsoring is a dictatorship. I'll put off my video so that I can be clearly heard on audio. I hope you can still hear me, Milton.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, internationally, we all subscribe to the same values, the same standards of human rights. And therefore, it would be a double standard for the international community to embrace a renowned tyrant, to embrace a person that has been ruling the people of Uganda on gunpoint for 36 years now. It is clear that election observers from the European Union and the United States were blocked from observing elections in Uganda. The internet was switched off. There was terror. There were massacres everywhere. Abductions started during campaigns and they are still ongoing. The opposition is being stifled. That is not democracy. And definitely that is not something that in the world-known democracies should be associating with.
Thank you. David Steele?
Thank you, Milton, for that. His Excellency Robert Chagulanyi Sentamu, if you can stay online, and we will ask for questions from members of the media who may still be here. Otherwise, we do intend to open the floor to general questions. So if you're available and able to stand to listen in and maybe take some of the questions, that would be excellent. But we do realize that you are traveling and your connection may be compromised. Thank you. Nico, did you have anything to add before we move to the question session?
Yeah, I have looked at the 4 hands that we have up, and since one of them is from a team member of uVote, I presume, which is John, I would like to give him the floor first, and then I would also like King Assad, a blogger, to unmute so he can ask the second question. So please, John, ask your question.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Nico. And I hope everybody's hearing me. This is John Lemma, and I'm a part of uVote group. My question goes to Bruce, and maybe the president himself can also answer it. I have 2 questions. The first one regards the sanctions that are being put on these various government officials and military officials. So my question to Bruce is, the international world is putting these sanctions to these individuals, but how comes they're not putting the sanctions on the government itself, whereby they have the truth, they know what is going on? And then the second one goes to you, Bruce, as a lawyer, and then to the president. Given that the past elections, we know there was too much fraud, and everybody knows that NUP won the elections, but due to the misconceptions and all that they did. So my question is, did the US, as Bruce, you told us, Uganda would rather deal with the US than China? Did the US approve and say the elections were fair and they were conducted well? If it's a no, so why is the US government still funding the Ugandan government that they know that is not working on what? On the right criteria, whereby they say they have to work with governments that support their people and work with their people.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Should we ask President to take his response first, and then we'll move on to you, Bruce. His Excellency, if you're still available, please could you look to respond to the questions that have been asked. We'll try and get His Excellency unmuted.
Hello, hopefully I am well heard now.
Yes, we hear you loud and clear.
Yes, thank you very much for asking. It's definitely clear that it was not a free and fair election. If at all, it was election anyway, because even the results were not considered, as so much unwarranted things went on, including switching off radio stations. Whether you ask why the US is still in collaboration with Uganda, why it is still sponsoring different initiatives with Uganda, why it still has a relationship with Uganda. That is certainly not my question. Maybe there's a question that together we should ask the United States. But again, I will tell you that General Museveni has played his game well by presenting himself as a Democrat until recently, when it was clear for everybody to see. I know General Museveni has over time blackmailed the United States, presenting himself as the only anchor of stability in the Great Lakes region. He has always threatened to withdraw troops from the AMISOM mission whenever he's been called upon to respect human rights. So I want to believe that maybe the United States looks at the American interests, which include the fight on terror, which many of us stand with. However, I think that it's important for the United States administration to remember that they do not need tyrants in Africa. They do not need dictators to further their interests in Africa. That's why we always remind them that the people of Uganda and Africa at large would like to have bilateral collaborations with the United States, but that should not come at the cost of human rights. It should not come at the cost of the freedoms of the people of Uganda.
Thank you. Bruce, did you want to answer the question on sanctions on persons visa as opposed to governments, please? Thank you.
Bruce, unmute.
I'm trying. I'm
Okay,
good.
there you
Okay, thank you. Yes, let me thank President Tragalanis for his comments, which are very insightful. Let me be a little more blunt as an American. To some degree, there's an element, frankly, of racism in US foreign policy, in that Americans assume that Africans need a strong man in office. And Americans don't quite believe yet in the power of democratic government in Africa. And I think that plays into the US support for these dictators. And as President Chagalani said, Museveni has played a good game of appearing to be a Democrat until that's been exposed recently. So I think first the US supports these regimes because it doesn't fully believe yet that Africans are ready for democracy. And this is an unfortunate belief, because in those countries where democracy is practiced in Africa, countries have thrived, they've been stable, they've acted under the rule of law, they've eliminated or reduced terrorism, and they've had progress for their people. And Africa has demonstrated that it can make democracy work. And the US still has to get out of this mentality of believing that Africans need a strong man. And that's part of why the US keeps supporting these regimes. The other element is, frankly, I think the US fears that if it drops Uganda, China will immediately step in. And we have to overcome that rather false belief. As President Chagalani just said, any democratic regime is going to fight terrorism and will join that fight. And we don't need to support a dictatorship that suppresses and abuses 50 million people in Uganda just to do peacekeeping in unpopulated parts of Somalia and Sudan. The balance is wrong. And that's a message that the US needs to start to understand. But the persistence of the opposition in Uganda is important. That will send the message to the US government that this opposition can be relied on as the successor government. With regard to the issue of sanctions, there are limits to US law. And the way US law operates is that sanctions are placed upon individuals. The president does not have the power to sanction a whole country. It's a question of how Congress allocates the budget in supporting a foreign government. So in answer to, I think, Milton's question, unfortunately, it was John's question, the US can't, the President Biden or President Trump cannot simply issue sanctions against an entire nation. There's a process to go through. Let me say this, though. I don't think the US ever accepted that this was an honest election. In the last month of the Trump administration condemned Uganda's human rights abuses following the riots and massacre in November. And the Biden administration did respond very promptly, condemning the outcome of these elections, unlike the UK, which actually seemed to endorse them. So I think the US does not accept that these were honest. It did condemn these elections. And it's working through, I think, how to deal with its funding of this regime. This is a problem. Foreign policymakers get committed to a course of action, and it's hard for them to break away. And we have to keep working on that. Let me just say one further thing. As Honorable Chagalani said, the money Uganda receives is not being used for terrorism. It's mostly being used to create a system of suppression within Uganda. In the same way that Israeli software sold to fight terrorism was used to monitor US diplomats' phone accounts. So I think the US is beginning to understand the problem. It will eventually respond the right way, but it's a slower process. I hope that's of some assistance in answering it. I don't speak for the US, obviously, but that's my analysis. The US will come around, but it takes time.
Thank you, Bruce. I'd like to ask King Assert to unmute himself and ask your question, and then after King Assert, we'll open up to the general public to ask your questions, and we'll take 3 or 4 questions before we close down. Thank you so much. King Assert, if you're able to phrase your question in 1 minute, introduce yourself, ask, confirm who the question is for, and phrase your question in 1 minute. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much, David. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Excellent. Yes, my name is, I just go by nickname King Assert for security purposes as for now. And my question is towards, it's a general question, so anybody, especially the leader for NUP, can be able to answer this question. Today, we're looking at the incident that took place in January of last year, and less than 30 days ago, for the district elections in Kayunga, we saw the same incident happening. And so, but when we compared the incident from January of last year, we saw that there were, from a legal perspective, that we saw there were actions and steps which were being taken, and the general populations were being informed, step by step. However, for Kayunga, we're seeing maybe there's less information coming out about what is taking place. So my question is, are we looking to just strategize in a different ways, or like we still have not gotten a clear picture of what is taking place and or what's going to take place next in for the elections in Kayunga? Yeah, I don't know if my question was clear.
King Assert, can I just confirm your question is about what the next steps are with regards to the Kayunga elections?
Yes, generally from like a legal perspective.
Okay,
and also,
thank you.
Yes, thank
All
you.
right, okay. Over to Bruce and President, whoever wants to take that question.
I think it's really a question for the president, actually, because it really relates to the electoral or political issues.
Okay, we'll
actually, if the president cannot comment, I have spoken to Harriet Nakweda today. I can also comment.
Thank you, Nico. We'll try and get President unmuted if he can hear us to respond to that. Thank you. Nico, while we try and establish that connection, did you want to give your thoughts on the back of your conversation with Harriet? Thank you.
Yes, so Harriet has told me that they have already submitted their appeal to the court. There are still some documents to be added. So everything is going according to schedule for this case to be presented to court. That's it.
Okay.
I think, if I may say, I think David Lewis sent a note that he had some information as the party secretary general. I think David said he is able to join in on that.
David, please unmute yourself.
No, well, I think Nico gave a very good update that we're trying to use the legal avenue. One of the avenues, of course, is the legal one. We already filed a case with the High Court here to challenge that election. As all of you know, this kind of election, we have all the DRR forms. We collected all the DRR forms from Kayunga, which gave us a clear lead of about 15,000 votes ahead of the NRM candidate. So we filed a case and attaching all this evidence, and today our lawyers have been able to serve both the Electoral Commission and Mwonge, the person who was declared winner in that election. So the case should be starting soon. Note that we have a lot of hope in that in the courts in Uganda, but we use all avenues to, of course, highlight these challenges, but also to make sure that the evidence of rigging and all that is filed formally before courts of law.
Thank you, David. Okay, we're going to go through the other questions that we have, and in the interest of time, we're going to restrict the questions to the 4 hands that were up right at the start of the question process. So, Enid, James, Samuel, and Jakampulira. So please, those of you who won't be able to make, please bear with us. We're just, in the interest of time, we need to get this wrapped up. So Enid, please could you unmute yourself and ask your question. You've got 1 minute to phrase your question. Please confirm who the question is for and proceed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Thank you so much. Thank you. My question, which is more probably of a concern, is towards our General Secretary, Mr. Louis Rubongoya, or even the President himself. I would say it's more probably of a concern because, okay, basically I'm asking about the young men who were tortured, and for example, one of them who was found in the mortuary, and then another one who the last young man who was interviewed by the activist, Mr. Lumbuye. These two young men have been popping up here and there about their security, number one. That's why it's a concern to me. And then why are they still coming up when they are people who are, I know this is quite of a sensitive question and a concern, and I don't mind if you don't give more full information, but can something be done knowing how sensitive their lives are at stake? So that's part one. Now, another thing, Mr. Lubongoya, why is our NUP generally, why is there no organization, something that is put up so that whoever can, we contribute towards like the welfare of these people, whether it's £1, whether it's 1 shilling, but something made so that some income comes in, and whether it will be some charitable, whatever.
Peter, good
why
morning.
are these things not in place? Thank you.
Thank you, Enid. David, would you like to respond to those two questions, and then we'll proceed to the next ones, because I think they're quite direct to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Comrade Enid. The
Thanks,
first
Peter.
question about
Great.
the people who were tortured and who are, of course, these people are coming up. Majority of them are simply desperate because they want to either travel out of the country because of safety concerns. And I'll say that there are very, very many others who are keeping a low profile because up to now they are still being hunted and that kind of thing. Of course, NUP has done we try to do our best to, in some cases, connect them to either families outside some areas, and that's why I said it's a bit sensitive. Sometimes we try to make sure that they are safe, and for now we've tried to deal with their safety in many ways. But regarding contributing to the party, they are on our website, and maybe I'll also text you here in the comments how you can contribute to the party. You can send mobile money, but you can also, there's a link, a flutter of link where you can directly deposit money, either from your card or something. And then we can use that to support our welfare team. We have a welfare department which takes care of these victims. I'll say that there are very, very many more victims who are still coming up. Yesterday, I met someone who they badly tortured, and this person is looking for lots of money to go out of the country. So the pressure is just too much, but we try to deal with it within the available means.
Thank you, David. The question about the number or the contribution mechanism has been asked before, so if you can share it and people get it, but also would love to distribute that widely. Thank you so much. James William Mugeni, you have 1 minute to introduce yourself. Tell us what the question is and who you're directing it to. Over to you. Thank you.
My question will go to Ugandans and then the leadership. I don't mind if the leadership will manage to take it up. Question number one, what is the US foreign policy with Uganda? Because I'm one person who one time served the US as a foreign service national, and the US foreign policy at that time was democracy, peace in northern Uganda, and fighting HIV/AIDS. I'm wondering if that policy has changed. And if it is in democracy, what have we achieved in democracy? Then number two, which is a quick one, almost related to the first one. They keep telling us the Western world is fronting Bobi Wine. But it is like, it's a double standard that we are not understanding. Which Western world fronts Bobi Wine? And yet, every day, I'm seeing the US ambassador struggling to explain to Ugandans or to the world the assistance that the US gives the defense, the army in Uganda, and then perhaps USAID and other things where the US is involving that money. How are we countering this? Lastly, I'm sure there are very many questions.
James, I'm so sorry, because in the interest of time, we'll just stick to the two questions that you have. Thank you so much. Thank you, James. So I'll put those questions out to those who are here. So David and Bruce, Afran, and President, if you're available, please. Should we start with Bruce? Did you have any thoughts around the questions, specific questions around US policy and the fact that the US is, I think it's linked to a question you answered previously, the US still continues to fund Uganda with nearly $1 billion.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I wish I had a better answer to this well-stated question. US foreign policy is a persistent thing over many administrations. It usually does not change very much from president to president. And when the US has gotten into a habit of funding certain areas of the world or certain governments for certain reasons, it's very difficult to get it to stop that. The foreign policy establishment is a type of permanent government, and it's difficult to get it to change course. It does happen, but it's not an easy thing to achieve. It does not mean that the US supports Museveni, and it does not mean that the US has closed its eyes to the abuses in this government. Unfortunately, though, the funding of a government such as Museveni is a long-term project that is not easy to change. And that's a reality we have to live with. But the US has put pressure on the Museveni regime. But look to other areas, not just the money. That's my advice. The funding of Uganda's military will probably continue from the US. But it is now impossible for Museveni, for example, effectively to leave Uganda. He cannot travel to Europe. He cannot travel to Asia because the international pressure is such that he doesn't know whether there's a warrant against him.
Right.
The US and other governments have engaged in this activity as we are. So look to those factors rather than the money the US gives Uganda. That would be my advice. I hope that's of comfort and a good answer.
Thank you, Bruce. Milton, did you want to add anything to what Bruce has quite nicely put forward? Thank you.
Yes, very briefly. Bruce put it very well in terms of the dictator not being able to travel comfortably overseas. And I will give you a sidebar here. Since 2017, when there was a trial in US federal court here in New York over corruption allegations that a Chinese national named David Ho had paid a bribe of $1 million to open the way for more bribes to come to General Museveni and his foreign minister, Sam Kutesa. That trial concluded and Patrick Ho was convicted and sentenced to 3 years. What was most spectacular during that trial is that the photographs of both Museveni and Kutesa were displayed in the courtroom like common criminals to the jury. And it had a label underneath the photos, exhibit number 1504, I believe was Kutesa, and 1510 was General Museveni, or vice versa, but those two numbers are the correct numbers. Since then, they've not traveled to the United States. And here's another interesting part, because I covered this trial extensively. Regime officials started contacting me to ask me if it was safe for Sam Kutesa to travel to the United States. So Bruce is completely 100% on target. One other thing I'd like to add. Bruce spoke about the underlying racism that influences US policy, not toward only Uganda, but Africa generally. That is a very critical point that is not sufficiently dealt with. And in the future, I would actually suggest that we organize a webinar just focusing on that issue. It's very critical. And I think we should push back against that, and we might see that impacting US policy toward Africa in a different way. So thank you, Bruce, for bringing that up. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Milton. Okay, we've got two more questions, and then I'll hand back over to Milton to wrap up this afternoon's press conference. Okay, Samuel Kisitu.
David, just a second. I have one little question. There's an account online by the name of Miriam Blackso. That is the name of the NRM Ugandan ambassador in Brussels. If it is really her, then I really would like to have some questions for her. Thank you. I think you can continue with your other question.
Thank you, Nico. We wait to see the response. Samuel, please could you unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and phrase your question, and let us know who the question is directed to. Thank you. You have 1 minute to phrase your question. Thank you.
Well, thank you, comrades, for this wonderful meeting. My name is Samuel Kisitu, and I refer you to the Canadian press. On the 19th January last year, they published an article which had a message that the Canadian government is deeply concerned about the political situation in Uganda, but it says it has no plans to stop deploying military aircraft to the African Union, to the African nation, that's Uganda, where it has been helping different United Nations peacekeeping missions. Well, in my understanding, I see that Canada and the US in mission, they tend to give an indirect support to the dictator through the UN mission. And the same UN mission is where we run to seek for our humanitarian dignity, to find justice in the United Nations Human Rights Commission, where we have never become successful. So it becomes a no work done for every year to go doing that, for the dictator to send power for every other term. So in the same article, it ended that
Samuel, sorry, Samuel, could you please phrase your question so that we can get the question passed over? Thank you, rather than the background to the question. Thank you.
Sure. Canada continues to show that investigations will be done, just the same as US. For me, I see that the great 8 countries, which are the UN bosses, are the betrayer of us. And in this is a tactical situation that it brings immigrants to this country, that our countries will be disrupted of peace, and we have to run this country to provide labor. That's my understanding. So I'm worried about that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think Samuel's just given his thoughts on the relationship between the US and Canada and the supply of weapons. If there's anyone, Bruce, maybe David, who's got any thoughts, maybe Milton, just on the back of Samuel's assertion or the conclusion he's come to, please, because I don't think there's a question phrased in there. What do you have to say? Could you add something to your thoughts
maybe I'll
to the
go
mix?
first. If I could go first, because I may have to leave for this court conference in a couple of minutes. First of all, thank you all for doing this. I'm sorry I have to leave a few minutes early. I'll try to stay on, but if they call me on my other Zoom link, I'll have to leave. I think what we're dealing with is the interlinking of different priorities and policies. There's no question the West is committed to the peacekeeping missions. There's no question that the influence of ISIS and other groups could be very damaging to Africans. And so these peacekeeping missions are important. It's unfortunate that Uganda became so much a part of that, more at a time when Museveni was more democratic, but we're stuck with that legacy. So I don't think our focus should be on that as a sign that the West does not care about Ugandans' problem. We're stuck with that history of peacekeeping missions, which are important in their own right. But I don't think that means the West is insensitive or closing its eyes to what is happening. Both things are working together, sometimes in conflict, sometimes together. We just have to accept the reality of those interlinked political goals. That's the best answer I would give at this stage.
David.
Over to you, Milton.
Yes, I just want to add on a little bit to that as well. To the person that asked the question relative to Canada's involvement and the other countries that support the mission to Somalia. Obviously, General Museveni has taken advantage of that by deploying the largest contingent, and he uses that, as Bobby Wine pointed out earlier, as a bargaining chip. He always brings up the Somalia card when he's challenged on human rights issues. Oh, if you push me too far, all I have to do is withdraw my troops. But I think increasingly that's becoming a lesser of an effective card because more African countries are involved. I think Kenya also increased its participation. So I think that's becoming, excuse me, less of an effective card. And I do agree with Bruce as well that the Western countries are not going to abandon that operation overnight. But Bobby Wine has also made the argument that Ugandans actually want peace and stability for our brothers and sisters in Somalia. So there's no reason why a democratically elected, legitimate government in Uganda would not support participation in any operation, legitimate operation, to bring peace and stability to Somalia. So that's all I wanted to add.
May I just say I'm going to have to leave now to go on to my court case. I wanted to just thank you all for allowing me the honor of being part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, for your time and the effort to the struggle. Thank you so much. David Lewis, if you're still online, do you have anything to add with regards to the whole positioning of Uganda as our brother's keeper and the general using it as his bargaining chip?
I think I totally agree with Milton that General Museveni has tried to project himself as the guarantor for stability in the Great Lakes region. Our view is that he has been probably one of the most fundamental causes of the mayhem in this region. In fact, as opposed to being looked at as somebody who has fought to bring stability. If you look at almost every violent form of conflict in the Great Lakes region, he's always been involved, and that hasn't given us a good reputation in most of these countries. So I think I agree entirely that our policy, for example, foreign policy as NUP is not against supporting peacekeeping missions as long as it's done legally. As long as the relevant organs, for example, of government are consulted. Right now we're in the Congo, and one of the questions we've been raising, many Ugandans have been talking about, is why is it that you go to Congo without even following a basic principle of going to parliament, getting parliament to approve it? Because that's what the law of Uganda says. But because we live in a country which does not believe in the rule of law, where the regime does not believe in the rule of law, he simply ignores all that and goes on these military excursions. So I totally agree that the earlier we get rid of this regime and make sure that everything is done in line with the law, that's when we'll have true freedom and true peace, even within the region.
Thank you, David. That marks the end of the Q&A session. I'd like to invite Dr. Nico to say a few words, and then we'll hand over back to Professor Milton Alimadi for final remarks and close. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, David and Milton, for hosting this program. And so, unfortunately, Miss Miriam Black, that has logged on, is not responding, because otherwise I would have asked her to comment on the recent quote that she gave to a Dutch journalist, in which she said that safe houses in Uganda do exist, but there's no torture there, and that actually safe houses are necessary. I'm really curious to know if she can actually confirm that she said so, but she doesn't want to be unmuted. So that's too bad. Maybe the NRM can join for our next press conference, right? I mean, we give free speech here. Anyone can speak, even NRM. So I was really happy with this press conference. I want to thank all the journalists that have joined, although I see that some of them have already left. But that is the reason why today we chose a little bit of a different format, to have a small question section in the middle and a larger question sections at the end. Those are my final thoughts. Thank you very much. You're unmuted, David.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Nico. I'd like to hand over to Professor Milton Alimadi, who has been our main host for this afternoon, evening, to share his final remarks and bring this to a formal close. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sisters and brothers, friends, comrades, all of you for today's participation. Thank you to my co-host, David Steele. Thank you, Dr. Nico. And thank you to President Robert Kyagulanyi, aka Bobby Wine, for finding the time, even with the bad connections, to address the public. People wanted to hear your views. Thank you to the Secretary General, David Lewis. Thank you for Dr. Lida Ledriga. Thank you for Joel Senyonji. Although your connection was very challenging, we still got a chance to hear from you. And thank you for Bruce Afron as well, for providing the legal perspective. We had planned to go from 8 to 9:30. It is 10:20 almost, we're still here. But I'm glad we had this format where we got media people to ask their questions before they left. I think this format works well. Thank you, Nico, for noting that Miriam Black, an NRM personality, was also apparently listening. And that is good. That is a very good sign. It means, number one, they want to learn. And then number two, they know that NUP is very powerful and has built a very effective following. And then finally, she might actually be considering whether to join the right side of history. And if that is the case, she is certainly welcome, and to bring others from her colleagues who also want to join the right side of history. On that note, thank you so much. I look forward to inviting you to a future event. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening.
Stand Up Uganda are pleased to announce the launch of the People Power Academy Civic Education Program, scheduled to start on 8th January 2022. The program consists of a number of modules that have been developed by leading thinkers in the space of dictatorships, democracy, human rights, and the use of non-violent action to reclaim the power of the people. The program will be delivered on the Uganda is Bleeding platform over the next 8 weeks and aims to transform each of our participants into educated, informed, and empowered activists with the knowledge and skills to confidently engage and mobilize citizens to stand up for democracy, defend the rule of law, and human rights. We have assembled a formidable lineup of distinguished professionals to facilitate the delivery of the modules in the program, including Dr. Lina Zedriga Waru, Deputy President NUP in charge of Northern Uganda, visiting lecturer and international trainer of trainers. Dr. Lina is a distinguished activist for inclusive peace and security and a renowned feminist. Milton Alimadi, Assistant Professor of Journalism at Columbia University, is an adjunct professor of African history at John Jay College of the City University of New York and is the publisher of Black Star News. Professor Alimadi is the author of Manufacturing Hate: How Africa Was Demonized in the Western Media. Dr. Neko Shunduward, Team Leader Youth.